Algebra 2 skills number 10, solve quadratic equations by square roots. Okay, so when are we going to use square roots to solve a quadratic equation? And we're going to use it if we see only one variable. We don't see both x and x squared at the same time. And we'll see that specifically here in a bit. The actual method, we're going to first isolate the squared part, take the square root of both sides, include a plus or minus on the side away from the variable, and solve. And that third step may seem a little bit strange. What's this plus or minus for? So let's talk about why that is. And the reason for it is when you take the square root of x squared, it's by definition the absolute value of x. And the absolute value of x is solved with a plus or minus operator. Okay, and when we actually see an example, you'll understand why. When we're solving, we want to include all the values of the variable that make the equation true. If you include a number like, say, 9 right here, 9 squared is 81, well, the negative 9 squared is also 81, and so you get the same solution. So there's an issue there when we take the square root of x squared. Now, to clarify, if no variables are involved, you're going to want to just say 3. You don't say the square root of 9 is negative 3. We'll go with what we call the principal square root. So that's just a little clarification. But when you have an x squared under a square root and you're trying to get it just to be x, you do need the plus or minus. So let's look at some examples. This is a quadratic equation because the highest power is 2, and square roots are available here because we only have the one variable that we talked about. Step 1, isolate the x squared. So we add 3 and divide by 4. Step 2 is take the square root of both sides, and when you do that, you get x equals 3. The square root of 9 is 3. Now here's that plus or minus operator. So again, to clarify, why is that? Let's just go back to this line. 3 squared is 9, but negative 3 squared is also 9. Okay, so I need both of them. And there's a couple different ways that we could say it. Actually, 3 ways you could say it like this. But that plus or minus is not some kind of special, super secret thing here. It just means plus or minus 3, just written all at once. Or you could list it as negative 3 comma 3 like this. So those are all saying the same thing here. A second example, you see a lot of times a parenthesis. So here it looks like it's not x squared at all. It looks like it's just x. But again, we go by that idea of just one visible variable. So we can isolate the squared part, if you remember the instructions. So that 9 and that 6 have got to go. They're not squared. So that 9 is the easiest thing to deal with first. Let's just add it to both sides. So 45 plus 9 is 54, and divide by 6. So we get x minus 1 squared. Again, we have 9 here. Okay? So at this point, you're going to take the square root of both sides. All right, so I'm going to show you, I'm going to split the screen here to show you 2 different ways to settle this. You take the square root of both sides, and again, you get plus or minus 3. So now the issue is we have a 4th step that we didn't have to worry about in the first example, and that is we've got to solve. We've got to get x by itself. We don't want to leave it like this. So that 1's got to go. We're going to add it to both sides, and we've got this sort of awkward looking 1 plus or minus 3. But remember, this just means positive 3 and negative 3 at the same time. So 1 plus 3, well, that's 4, and 1 minus 3 is negative 2. You just kind of do both operations. So that's how some people handle it. Others may take a different approach. Let's go back to this line. Again, take the square root of both sides. And some people like to go ahead and split that plus or minus up into 2 parts like this. X minus 1 equals 3 or x minus 1 equals negative 3. And if you choose to do that, it is more writing, but it keeps this sort of awkward sign and gets it out of the way. And it makes 2 really easy equations to solve. So if I add 1 on both of these equations, I get the same solution, 4 and negative 2. A third example, similar to the previous example, but here we don't get a number that resolves easily, which is actually a good thing here. But again, let's go to our steps. Isolate the squared parts. Let's divide by 2, and then let's take the square root of both sides. Okay. When you do that, you're going to get plus or minus the square root of 10, but square root of 10 doesn't resolve. And again, that actually saves us some time here. We can just subtract the 7 and just be content with that. Now, of course, the square root of 10 has value. You could add to it. You could subtract. You could add negative 7 in the square root of 10, which is decimal, negative 7 minus the square root of 10. But typically, we like it in real form, so we don't do that. Now, to clarify, this plus or minus operator does indicate 2 solutions. So it would be equivalent to what you see here, negative 7 plus square root of 10 and negative 7 minus the square root of 10. A quick 4th example, you should never have something squared be negative. If you have something squared be negative, There's an imaginary going on in there, and you can deal with it. But in terms of real solutions, we're going to say no solution. Now, you could go ahead and take this square root and say plus or minus I root 3 and add the 1. So that may be what you do in this section. So realize that when I say no solution, I mean no real solution. But for here, if you're only finding real solutions, you'd say no solution here. So I just wanted to add that little part.